Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guests, sound designers Mark Mangini and Theo Green, join us to talk about their work on Dune. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode, so make yourself comfortable as we jump into the conversation with Mark and Theo. Hi, Mark and Theo. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Robert. Pleasure to be here.
Hi, nice to meet you, Robert. Thank you.
I think this could potentially be the best sounding podcast that I've done, but I don't want to jinx it just in case something cuts out by mistake or we lose connection or anything. So touch wood that it's all going to be sounding perfect.
Looking forward to it. I went and purchased a really nice lavalier mic so that you would get maybe a decent recording of my voice versus the built-in microphone on my monitors.
I think we've
you're gonna get AirPods from me. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I think, as old saying always goes, I'll fix it in post.
Don't ever say that. Kiss of death.
So we're here to talk about Dune today, and I guess the first question that I have for you guys is, where do you begin with creating the sound design for a film like this? Do you get given a script and you start breaking it down by pinpointing areas where you think there's going to be certain sounds that you need to create? Or do you get images from pre-production as well of what spaceships are going to look like what worlds look like? Or does it all sort of come together later on for you guys?
I think all of those things is probably the answer. Mark and I definitely work in different ways. So, I mean, I'll say something very quickly, but I think Mark approaches things in a slightly different way to me. We both got sent early images of, yes, exactly what you said, you know, what the ornithopters were going to look like.
And script. I don't mean to jump into
and script, importantly. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it's super important to see imagery. I'm not brilliant at reading a script and knowing what that's going to turn out to be like. But when I see images and I see the colors they've chosen, you know, I see the type of design that they're going for, it starts to become obvious what the overall tone of a film is, what the overall aesthetic is. It was when I received the script that I started thinking I really need to understand what a sand dune sounds like, what a desert is like, because I'd never been to one before. And you know, that's lazy of me because I've been in California for a while and I knew that there were deserts, you know, a short drive away. So for me, it was a case of a sort of experiential dive into the script, that is taking the script out to the desert and playing with sand and thinking about the desert and imagining what the atmosphere of a Denis Villeneuve take of Dune would be, playing around with recording sounds in the desert, just seeing what I got. Because sometimes, you know, you think, oh, we should record sand. And then when you actually hear your recording back, you're like, doesn't sound like what sand should sound like, you know. So I needed to mess around. I didn't have enough experience with, you know, what was going to clearly be a considerable factor in the film, which was sand and dunes and desert, and I needed to mess around and make mistakes and learn. But over to you, Mark.
You know, one of the elements that makes Theo and I such an amazing partnership is that we both approach sound creation and sound design in very different ways. As you can hear from Theo's description, I would argue that where Theo is the empath, the sort of brooding artist, and I say that in a very respectful way, I'm the pragmatist. I read a script and my first thoughts are, how do we break this down? What are the elements we need to achieve that don't exist in reality, and how can we break those into components so that we can attack them efficiently and intelligently? And so that means, I think obviously, you read a script, you know worms don't exist in the real world. They need to be created. Shields don't exist. The voice doesn't exist. Ornithopters don't exist. And that list goes on. And I usually begin in a very practical way, breaking apart what the components are that we need to create. And then Theo and I kind of convene and figure out how are we going to attack this? Do we need to go out to the desert and experience the desert? Do we need to go record flapping wings for ornithopters? Do we need to bring in voice artists to render an element to the voice? Thus begins a many month-long or maybe even years-long process of looking at the proverbial tabula rasa, the blank canvas, and saying, holy shit, we got to make something out of nothing. What do you want to do? And off we go.
In a film like Dune as well, I guess you guys are the unsung heroes in terms of sound.
Can I get an amen?
Well, I think what we got taught early on in when I was studying film is that sound is probably one of the most important parts of a film. As audience members, you can forgive if an image is slightly off, because sometimes an image can happen so quickly that you're not sure if you caught it or not. You could just think that maybe I've just blinked too fast, so something's a bit off on the image or something's popped up. But with sound, I guess as collectively as well, if you're in a cinema or now with people's sound systems at home, you can always pick something up if something's a bit off. When you're working on a film that there's a sci-fi film that has so many different elements with different planets, different sort of, as you mentioned as well, things that don't really exist. Do you feel like you have more free reign in creating the sounds for each scene and also for like the planets and different ideas? And are there like, maybe this is a bit more musical, but is there a sort of motif that you like to be associated with maybe each of different houses or different areas that are involved in the film?
I think that sound has a unique benefit in that human beings, and this is a pet hypothesis of mine, human beings, generally speaking, are far more visually literate than they are sonically literate. And what that means is we aren't often consciously aware of what we hear as much as we are consciously aware of what we see. That means Theo and I can work our kind of sonic alchemy in the background, even though it's not in the background. You are hearing everything that we've created, but we have this sort of backdoor way of telling stories with sound without having to use words. We can influence your perception of a movie with sound without triggering a mechanism that makes you conscious or aware of it.
Yeah, I think you talked about music as well, having the quality of a motif and being able to kind of define, as we're used to the sort of light motif of many scores of sci-fi movies in the past that define a particular character is on screen. Here's Darth Vader, or here is this planet. Sound definitely has the power to do the same thing, but referencing what Mark just said, it works on such a subliminal level that even music, when it comes in, you know that there's music there, and you realize, at least if you've thought about film on any level at all, you realize, oh, here's the sad music. I'm supposed to be feeling sympathetic for this sad character now, or here's the dark music. Clearly, this is a bad guy, or whatever. You're aware, at least on some kind of split mind level, that you're being manipulated by something. Weirdly, I think it takes someone who's really studied sound in film to notice when the sound is doing something for you. Most audiences don't really consciously credit the things that the sound design is telling them. So we have that unique chance of steering a scene, in the same way we can point out that a character who you're meeting for the first time is no good, or is a good character, or we can suggest that there is danger ahead, or that there is love in the air. All of these things without an audience ever really thinking that the filmmakers intended that to come across. So yes, we're kind of sometimes we're like the the first wave troopers of being able to convey what the emotion the filmmaker wants to the audience, and maybe then later the cavalry really come in with the score that the composer has written for that scene. But quite often, and as you pointed out, we have different planets, different houses, and quite a lot of the film, especially as we're setting things up, we're hopping about, meeting different people. And absolutely, yeah, Mark and I work very hard to established different sonic identities for the planet Caladan, which is, the most Earth-like, the most water-filled. We hear rain, we hear thunder, we hear sort of, oceans and birds. The only time that we actually hear an animal in any of these worlds. So, that sets up the fact that Paul is in a place that is going to be hard to leave, especially hard to leave for the sort of rigors and discomfort of the desert planet Arrakis. We also define the Harkonnen world as being industrial gone to extremes. It's a world where they plundered all of the resources, and it's kind of, I suppose you could say it's what would happen to the planet Earth if industry was left unchecked and we plundered all of the resources. It's a world of kind of greed and corporate mechanisms gone crazy. So, there we sort of sow that idea with, industrial soundscapes that we built, kind of containing every sort of industrial nightmarish noise that we could think of. And finally, Arrakis, it's important to us that it isn't just a hellhole, but that when we really get to experience the beauty of the sand dunes, that we also have there is a sort of softness and a beauty. And so we have, both the harsh, dusty, gritty Arrakis, where every hinge of every aircraft that opens has got sand trapped in it, but we also have moments of sort of rapture in the desert, I guess you could say. And in fact, early on in the film, we get that moment where Zendaya is giving a voiceover as Chani, introducing us to, the beauty of her planet. And we hear the spice kind of tinkling as soft winds go over the sand dunes. We kind of come back to that later and show that there is a romance, there is an attraction, there's a reason why Paul feels at home there as well. So all of these things are kind of our score, in a strange way, for these planets, for these worlds, done using sounds rather than conventional instruments. In the sense, we're also, whilst Hans Zimmer is composing, his own motifs and his own atmospheres, we're also composing motifs for each character, for each home world. And yet I feel that sometimes we get in there first and we kind of establish something that then the composer Hans Zimmer kind of turns into something much bigger and more epic and, a more tangible musical motif.
What's interesting as well when you pick up is how you're breaking down each planet to make it feel lived in. How Paul's planet, as you said, the birds, the water, and it has that home feel. And then Arrakis at the beginning, that's one thing that kind of does stand out when you see like my planet's beautiful, and then boom, the industrial side comes in, where you have people coming in and just stealing the resources and what comes from that. What I kind of want to pick up on as well is the various sort of, because you've already mentioned it with the planets, but then I do want to go into specifics. But before I get into specifics of the sound created for stuff like for the worms and
shields.
The shields, the ornithopters. Thank you. It's like playing charades there for a second. The ornithopters and the shields and everything. There's something that I picked up on in an interview where you guys mentioned about creating sound for the thumper and the worm, and the sort of, when you approached it, the idea was, what came first, the thumper, the idea of this invention of the thumper, or where was it the worm? And it's that sort of like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And I think something like that really stuck out to me, because it's the thought process of when you're creating this world and creating everything that's sort of inhabited in it, is that idea of what is coming first, and what, if we are having the sound of the worm, that's gonna affect the sound that we create for the thumper. And is that something that when you were creating these sounds, that this is the ideas that had to be thought through quite a lot? And did any of these sounds start changing once you had to make a decision on what they would be?
I think an important footnote to this discussion is this idea that sounds can live on their own as interesting sounds. And that's one approach to sound design, to make an exotic sound that no one has ever heard before. But I think Theo and I feel that if there is a narrative value to a sound that we make, meaning the sound tells a little piece of a story, and you hit on one of the really valuable ones, this relationship between the thumper and the worm voice. None of this was prescribed by Herbert in the books. This is a conceit that Theo and I contrived to give each individual sound a little bit more narrative resonance. It might cause or ask the audience to ask the question, which did come first, the thumper or the worm? And it creates a causal relationship between them. We think that makes the sounds that we make even more valuable and powerful than the sound in and of itself. Because, and that's one thing you can do. You can go off and make fantastical noises and the audience can say, "Ooh, wow, I never heard that before." But if we create this little narrative thread, it becomes that much more valuable to the movie. So this idea of the chicken and the egg idea of it has its roots in zoology, because when species move about to different terrains, the terrain adapts to the species and the species adapts to the terrain. And so perhaps there is a relationship between the two. And this gave us cause to develop two sounds with a relationship to each other.
In our case, I suppose we did have something which came first, which was that we knew that the sound of the thumper had to exist in the movie. So, and actually, I misspoke in another interview and said that it was in the original Dune book that Frank Herbert described the drum sand idea of the resonant sound attracting the sandworms. It's actually in one of the later books, and I can't remember if it's Dune Messiah but anyway, it's something which certainly comes from one of the Dune books that. You step on a certain kind of sand in the desert and it resonates like crazy. And we knew that from the script that there was drum sand, and we knew that there are thumpers which are placed in resonant areas of the desert in order to lure the worms. We knew pretty much what kind of thump we would need for that, although that was one of the more fun bits where we went out to the desert and recorded, thwacking a real sand dune with a giant hammer with microphones underneath. So we once we had that sound, Mark and I had been experimenting with various things of what the worm should sound like. I think my very first thing to Dinny, the worm rears up and really doesn't make any sound at all. And Mark and I knew that we were going to have to do better than that. But there was something about, the almost underwhelming quality of a worm that rears up and then doesn't do a giant Jurassic roar. We knew that it had to be something more intelligent than that. And I don't mean on our part, but that the worm is somehow communicating. It's not just a scary monster. It's in many ways, it's kind of like the god of the planet Arrakis. So we wanted to have a certain kind of, when Paul is confronted with it, we want to have a certain sort of moment of reverence. And obviously, if you just got a gross kind of monster opening its mouth and rah, then that reverence is gone, and all you're left with is fear. So we tried various things. I remember Mark told me about these records. What's the name of the guy who recorded the whales, Mark?
Roger Payne.
Roger Payne. There were these recordings of whale song. I bought the record, and when I listened to it, I realized that every single whale noise I'd ever heard, certainly anything that's ever been sampled and used in music, is straight off of that record. I mean, this guy's recordings are some of the classic whale recordings, and they're so full of personality and stuff. And initially, Mark and I were sort of thinking about the idea of, well, perhaps these sandworms have a way of communicating amongst each other, kind of across vast distances of the desert. It could be kind of like a whale. We tried initially taking some of those whale sounds and processing them, and still it wasn't the right thing. We realized that us humans have heard those sounds too many times to know, to think that there's something other than a whale. You hear it and you think ocean, and that wasn't quite right. But we knew that idea of something that an intelligent organism might be using to communicate across vast distances made sense. And I genuinely don't know who had the breakthrough moment, but it was, we had worked with Dave Whitehead before as a sound designer, and he's kind of part of our sound design sort of team. Sometimes we huddle together over the vast distances that we were sharing. He was in New Zealand, and think about these things. And we had, we played him the sand thumper, and asked him if he had any creature sounds, something which he does these amazing recordings of sort of walruses and other interesting animals. And he found something that was a deep kind of sound. And with a little work and thinking about it, Mark and I decided that actually has a sound that really reminded us of the sound of the thumper. So we worked between Mark, myself, and Dave Whitehead to space those sounds out so they sounded a little bit like the thumper. Dave did an amazing job of sort of pitching them down so that they sounded like they really came from a huge animal. When we got to the mix, we added, Doug Hemphill, our re-recording mixer, added things that made it really sound like that was coming from the back of a deep tube. We didn't really want to be as specific as to say this is coming from a throat. We didn't really know what part of the worm would be making this gunk, gunk, gunk sound. But, it's one of those things. The solution came about really as having batted about many other ideas, having then realized, no, communication and intelligence is something which is important to impart to this creature. And then a kind of breakthrough moment of realizing it has a very similar quality to those thumpers and a similar rhythm and a similar tone. So of course, that makes sense. Suddenly we're describing a world where symbiosis exists, where, the people who've been living on that planet for thousands of years have learned something from the animal, or maybe the animal has learned this sound from them. Anytime that we crack a moment like that and think that makes sense for the world, then we're adding something that, it's like adding backstory, or it's like adding something outside of the frame of the film that it just completes the picture. It's a subtext. It's it just gives you more believability in the world. So that's just one example. I mean, I think there are thousands of tiny examples of things where we were slaving over trying to find the right thing for the right moment. And it's that kind of that moment where you remind yourself it has to belong to the world. It has to emanate from the world. It has to be a reason for it existing in this world. And then, as if by magic, that also seems to enhance the story. It seems to sort of, when you find something that really belongs, it's an obvious win, because suddenly you're connecting dots. The original book is so full of rich, connected dots between all of the stuff that happens in these worlds. And of course, a film doesn't have the time to go into all of those tiny little details. But again, that's something where Mark and I, as sound designers, are able to provide all kinds of little background texture and details and information that helps you believe in the reality of a world.
You remind me, Theo, in our earlier experiments that failed, well, let's back up. One of the interesting pieces of subtext was this notion of Denis that this is such a dry world that he wanted the sound of the worm to have the absolute driest sound possible. Moisture is a resource. And our early experiments in the worm voice were these gargly kind of sounds that implied phlegm and moisture that was anathema, in fact, in a worm that spent its life under the sand with no contact to moisture. So our early experiments failed if for no other reason than they sounded phlegmy and gargly.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it's almost all of the things that we see in Dune. We had something that had been filmed with a camera that was very, very close to the final result. The worm and its insides were one of the few things that completely created with CG. So when Mark and I first started on it, we were looking at relatively crude renderings of what it might be like. Certainly, it wasn't down to the level of granularity where you can see the sand grains kind of dripping out of its mouth. So yeah, we had kind of imagined we would be able to see a bit more of a kind of a throat movement or something, saliva or something. And it was Denis reminding us, no, this is the driest organism on the driest planet. And then finally seeing the more finished CG renderings where we could see the baleen-like teeth of this sort of almost whale-like animal, except instead of there being any moisture, the sand was dripping out from between its teeth. And it's like, that reminds us exactly what we need to focus on. It's the wind going into the mouth. It's the sand dripping from the teeth. And actually, a lot of that gives you this. That's most of what you hear when the worm opens its mouth. There's only really one moment where we hear a gunk, 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 and that was the sort of the vocalization that we talked about before. But so much of it was really just defining it, not as being like any monster that we've seen in a movie before. It's not a monster. It's an organism that completely belongs on that planet.
Just a slight note. I think you both cut out a little bit there, but judging by your reactions to everything, I think we might have got it and everything. So fingers crossed I didn't
fix it in post.
Yeah, exactly. So it just jumped right back in. It's quite insightful as well, that the ideas, even just for the sandworm that goes into everything, and that actually the ideas that you guys probably need to painstakingly think through and go through, and also picking up on ideas that it sounds like there's some stuff that you guys create in a recordings studio, and then also just going out to various locations to get a feel of what is, the locations that are being shot at, but they're also getting an idea of what needs to be done. So the idea of the thumping in the sand in the desert on the dunes with a hammer, it's always, I guess in my mind, it's like the idea of like you're watching the final thing, but you don't understand the painstaking process that people go through just to experiment with the sound and the certain sounds that they use. Because I guess as a normal audience member as well, you associate certain sounds, but for a film they need to be built up differently. So I guess like a car starting, that's you know what that sounds like, but when you have to create it, you have to really bring emphasis on the sound and even record something that's not even a car starting.
You make me think of a very important sort of philosophical topic that undergirds everything that Theo and I did. And it started with Denis' kind of mission statement for Theo and I. And that was that he wanted the sound of Dune to be that of something real and organic and believable, as if a world that we had heard before. He might have even used the metaphor or the simile that make sound as if we dropped a documentary film crew on Arrakis and somebody put out a boom mic. So that ties into this idea, Robert, that you're talking about, that all of these sounds needed to feel familiar, and yet there's an interesting conundrum, because science fiction in and of itself is a genre that arguably is showing you and asking you to listen to things you've never heard before. And yet the charge for us was make this movie sound like it's something you had heard before. And that was the filter through which Theo and I created sound. If it didn't fit through that filter, if we couldn't hear it through that filter, it didn't belong in the movie.
And I'm going to say, I think it's much harder to do what we did. Of course, I think it's much harder to do what we did than what you traditionally hear in a sci-fi movie. And the reason for that, I mean, without getting into too much detail, if someone asked me to design a spaceship landing and firing a weapon, and I've got 3 minutes to do it, great. I'm going to pull an engine slowing down out of a sound library, and I'm going to slow it down even more. So instead of like, it's going to be like, okay, great. I'm going to put like some extra bass on there from a synthesizer. Okay, and here's the weapon firing. Well, I've got like, a laser sound that's on the library that kind of go, pew. Okay, I'm going to put that, and I'm going to put like a explosion on top of it. Great. So, you kind of make a layer cake of stuff that we kind of know, and you sweeten it and you make it heavier. You make it kind of sci-fi like by putting some synthesizers in there. Bosh, you got a spaceship landing and a weapon firing, and it all sounds like a sci-fi movie should, or like a computer game or whatever. The amount of kind of recording and labor and processing that we did to create something like a spaceship landing in Dune is considerably more, because, it's easy to impress, I think, in a sci-fi movie with kind of outlandish synthesized sounds that sound like, yeah, exactly, to be fantastical, which is, if someone was asking us to do, I don't know, a computer game based on like a big sci-fi franchise, that's the kind of way you'd go. It's what people expect. Instead, for instance, when we have a spaceship landing in Dune, we're thinking about the world. Again, we're thinking, look, this is 10,000 years into the future. This is technology that we can't even explain. It certainly isn't just a motor slowed down. What is it? Well, what would you hear if something was so advanced that it was a giant craft moving through the air? It would be really, what you hear is the wind resistance against a large body. Maybe actually as it comes through the clouds, it's creating turbulence. And so you hear actually something that's more like thunder. So, the amount of sort of processing of atmospheric recordings that we made in order to have something as simple as, a large egg-shaped spaceship descending, it's considerable. We're really trying to indicate how an atmosphere is perturbed by a large object moving through it, but without actually describing, oh no, there's a big jet engine or something in there. And, again, that really goes with Denis Villeneuve's style and aesthetics, the way that he designed the spaceships in Arrival, for instance. He's much more interested, and we knew this from the start, in the way that atmospheric, natural things sound, than in ever hearing what a synthesizer can impress you with in terms of just like a powerful jet engine-like sound or a big rumbling bass. So, as a result, Mark and I made a lot of very special custom recordings using strange microphones, strange techniques, and process those things, again, using, unusual techniques in order to create something we felt that no one has ever heard before, and at the same time really try and describe what a technology that is thousands of years ahead of us in the future might sound like. Duncan Idaho's spaceship, when it arrives, is entirely made out of wind and thunder. And again, if you just try and put some wind and thunder sounds together, guess what it sounds like? It just sounds like a bit of bad weather. In order to shape those things, and make them sound like a craft is approaching, turning, ducking, diving, landing, it requires a huge amount of manipulation of those sounds. So I feel like in order to make something sound completely natural, fitting into a world, not reminding us of all of the things that we know or that we've heard before in other films, and yet at the same time have that immersive effect of transporting you to another world like thousands of years off. Mark and I really sort of tested and challenged each other all of the time. And it's another reason why I think, our partnership works very well. We both come up with ideas in very different ways and then bounce them off each other and kind of have a bake-off of our ideas and knock each other out. If someone's come up with something which is genuinely outside of anything we've heard before, we instantly know it. It's okay, that's not a trope, that we're not doing something cliched there, let's try it.
So just want to go back to creating sounds for like the shields and the ornithopter. I also read there was certain like a combination of sounds. So the ornithopter had, because they do have that design of a giant insect, that guess sort of like a dragonfly. But I read somewhere that there was a combination of sound of like a large purring cat, a tent flapping, and I think even the fluttering wings of a large beetle.
Exactly.
Indeed.
Which now I guess to a normal person, when you kind of speak about these various things coming together to make that one sound, but when you're creating a sound for something like that, and I guess coming into the editing process of it and coming it all together, how do you get a mishmash of all those sounds and then layer them together to create what you want it to sound like?
Can I quickly follow on from what I was spieling on about before, Mark, and then I'll go back to you? Because I think, again, yes, if you try putting a beetle wing recording together with a cat purring and some tent flaps, it's going to sound like, it's pure comedy. It's certainly not going to sound like a piece of serious military hardware, which is really the brief that we got from Denis. These ornithopters shouldn't sound like something from Fantasyland, and this definitely shouldn't make us giggle. This is something serious. And so, yes, we use those elements. And when we talk about them, it sounds like, wow, what a bizarre brew of kind of witch's cauldron ingredients. But actually what we do on a technical level is so extremely boring that we can't really go into the great details. But imagine each beat of those beetles' wings being sliced up, pitched down, processed. Each little part of the cat purring likewise being synchronized with each one of those beetle wings. It's about kind of, often what we do seems to be about breaking up the reality of a recording into thousands of little fragments, reassembling them, as like a mosaic of parts, and making sure, of course, that these things synchronize with what we're seeing on the screen, so that the believability is there. There's a lot of highly technical work that goes into making those things not sound like an actual cat purring and sounding more like a big throb of a helicopter. But the reason that we go to those kind of recordings, rather than say a helicopter, which would be instantly, your ear would pick up on it and you'd be like, that just sounds like a helicopter. And the reason that we don't reach for a synthesizer or something that is outside of the reality of the things that we hear on a daily basis is that subliminally we recognize when we hear something that has been sourced from the real world. Mark, I'd love you to go into why that is, but that's very much an underlying reason for the way that we do things. And when we talk about organic sound, it's that's the reason that we base everything on recordings rather than synthesized sounds. Mark, please take it away.
Thank you, Theo. It's a pleasure to be here. Try the veal. Theo's hit on a number of really valuable topics. The first of which is that to achieve the effect that we've achieved requires a great deal of tedious and boring, minute editorial decisions of splicing and pasting and crafting that if you were to watch us do it, you'd yawn pretty quickly. But it's in that attention to detail that when you kind of zoom out and get the bigger picture, you begin to see something starting to take shape as its own unique creation. So as Theo has described, we have these three elements. We painstakingly synchronize thousands of little pieces of beetle, cat purr, and tent flap into sync with each other so that what you now have is a very plain, simple, constant sound of fluttering, the sound that would be just the wing component of the ornithopter. You now have a believable sound, that's the sound of flapping. But that isn't the sound of something actually moving in acoustic space. So you now have to then further manipulate that sandwich of sounds to make them feel as though they live in the real world of acoustics, where things turn on and they accelerate and they speed up and they slow down and they fly by you with Doppler shift. So you get that, you hear the pitch shift as something flies by you or something hovers above you. So then there's that layer of blending sounds that don't exist in the real world and making them feel as if they exist in the real world. Now, as Theo mentioned, one of the reasons that this sound is as successful as it is, and one of the reasons why, and one of the ways in which we achieved Denis' mandate of make this sound as if it lives in a real, believable world that we recognize, is that almost all of the components of sounds that never existed in the real world started life as acoustic recordings. We eschewed the use of electronic devices and synthesizers, and in some sense had a mandate of knowing what not to do so that we would avoid the science fiction tropes. In its worst case, what we didn't want was the theremin, the classic sound of a science fiction film, which is that we didn't want dumb, weirdo science fiction noises. And anytime something sort of veered in that territory, we knew we had to go in the other direction. So part of our success came through using acoustic sound as the raw elements to make the sounds of things we had never heard before. One of the reasons that works is that we trick the brain. We leverage well-known acoustic principles like IDL and ITL. These are artifacts of acoustic recording that tell the brain this sound happened in a real acoustic space. When you design from acoustic sound, those sort of subconscious components still live within the sounds themselves and aid us in our ability to suspend disbelief, meaning the disbelief in sounds that don't actually exist could exist because the sounds contain within themselves these components that tell the brain this is a real sound.
One of those things I think is simply complexity. I mean,
sure.
When you look at, there's a way that we can look at sound, a spectrograph, something where we're able to sort of look on screen and see in very visual way, you know, where the sounds, where the treble is, where the bass is, where the constituent parts of the sound are. And I notice that whenever I look at something that's generated by a synthesizer, I can instantly see that it's synthesized because it's not random and complex enough. It tends to be almost like, you know, someone could have drawn it with a computer. It almost looks like CG, you know, whereas something that's really been recorded is full of little nuances and details and complexities and randomness. And there's almost no way that you could ever synthesize something as complex as that. And I think that's what our ears know. You know, it's like what they talk about in CG, the sort of uncanny valley. You can get incredibly close to reality with CG, but somehow the closer you get, the more it freaks us out. Our brains know that we're being tricked, and that actually puts us off. It kind of pushes you out of a movie.
It becomes less believable.
Exactly. So, you know, for the same reasons with sound, you know, if we have a starting point that is sourced from the real world, not only is it more believable, but it seems to carry psychological information with it. It's as if there are all kinds of sort of sound design adages, like you put the sound of a tiger roaring in a spaceship going past, and you know, you may not hear the sound, but somehow our brains think on one level, tiger, power, roar, jungle, energy. It's like we don't even pick up on all of these things that are going through our head every time we hear a sound. But it only seems to really happen from something that is sourced from the real world. So we're constantly both burying real world sounds that you don't actually pick up on. They may be lower in volume or pitch than your brain would really be able to instantly identify. But our work is sort of loaded with these subliminal messages, I would say. And the more that we source those subliminal messages from things that people can identify with, the more believable that world becomes. There was just a couple of sounds that we did put in the movie that come from a synthesizer in one way or another. The most synthetic, you know, the thing that exists outside of the reality is spice, the spice hallucinations, the things when you go inside someone's mind, especially a vision of Paul's, especially if it's a spice-enhanced vision. Those were moments where we wanted to break with consensus reality for a moment and be inside a sort of psychedelic space. And certainly when we hear little grains of spice kind of floating around, there are little recordings of, I think it's like pieces of flash bulb that I found that are like a little tink, 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 tink. But I think it's quite important that hidden inside there are tiny little synthesized tick, 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 these little sort of square wave pieces that don't seem to fit with reality somehow. So there are moments where Mark and I really wanted to, in the movie, take us outside of that convincing reality that we'd so carefully constructed. And those are the moments where inside the character's head, they're leaving reality and going into the realm of the spiritual or the visionary.
Do you want to pick up on what you just said there when they're leaving the get into the character's mind and everything? Because I think that's very well done with something like the voice. And
yes,
it's weird because when you hear I guess if you hear it, it's kind of like an overlay of an echo of when somebody's talking, but it's done in a very sort of, you could tell whose voice is powerful enough for them to control with like the pitch and the
right.
And I guess not necessarily strength, but the sort of I guess it's a character trait. It's like the aggression and authority they have over the voice and controlling people. In the book, it's probably like I've read some of that, like Frank Herbert described it as they're calling on their ancestors and using advanced psychological techniques to manipulate others. With that sort of idea, how do you go about creating something like the voice to make sure that it creates that sort of commanding effect? And also, you're not just creating one version of it, but you're creating multiple versions of it to show people the sort of level that people are with using something like the voice.
Theo really is the master architect of the voice, and I'll let him tell most of this story. But one of the really important aspects of the voice that we wanted to achieve was that in this process of summoning an ancestor, we felt it valuable that it should be a woman. This is a Bene Gesserit technique, and the Bene Gesserit are an order of nuns, I think, for lack of a better term.
Space nuns.
Yeah, space nuns. And we wanted that, well, we wanted a number of things, one of which was not to do a traditional electronic processing. And we knew what we didn't want to do. We didn't want a traditional science fiction electronic processed, echoed, reverbed treatment, as is so often the case in voice processing. We felt as though it needed this additional narrative layer of the summoning of the voice of a powerful female ancestor. Theo and I would set about casting those voices to get the right texture to that, but I'll let Theo give you the detail on how we achieved it.
Well, one of the first guidances that Denis gave us on that, and when we talked about having an ancestral voice, was to listen to the voice of Marianne Faithfull, who was Mick Jagger's girlfriend in the 60s and a singer in her own right, and who these days has, one of those very deep, you can tell that she smoked a lot and had an interesting life. It's just a voice so deep that it's almost masculine, but clearly also, that of an older female. So we listened to her voice. We also knew that we wanted to work with someone who had great flexibility in the way that they deliver something that's somewhere in between, like a queenly kind of commanding voice and a witchy whispering rasp. We chose largely to work with an artist called Jean Gilpin, who was just amazing at being able to give us multiple different takes of whispered, rasping, witchy, queen-like kind of everything we wanted. We also worked with another voice artist called Ellen Dubin, and we recorded the real Marianne Faithfull as well, who is in there, although I think Jean is the most prominent of the three. We created this kind of, I guess, we processed that until it became a kind of strange, psychedelic, spiritual bubble of voices that we felt it sounded like Paul or any user of the voice was channeling they're kind of flicking through the family tree of the ancient Bene Gesserit ancestors and somehow arriving back at the original ancestor who first had this skill of casting the voice. We tried various things. We tried so that when someone casts the voice, that's the voice that comes out of their mouth, and you don't even hear the actor's original voice, which didn't work quite as well. Later on in the process, we came up with something where, as the actor utters the words that they're going to say, like "give me the knife," Jessica says in The Ornithopter, that you hear their voice, and then that kind of morphs into the many voices of the ancient Bene Gesserit ancestors, which also worked. And we kind of stayed with that as a basic model of what that should sound like. But we also wanted to kind of weaponize it and make it really feel like when someone is good at using the voice, the whole room kind of explodes with the power of their mental powers. And as if you're there in the room with them, you're experiencing it, you're feeling it in your body. And we knew that, in the cinema, we have the power of the LFE, as we call it, the subwoofer, that is able to produce those kind of frequencies that you feel in your body. So we would take the line that the actor said and process it in many ways to make it deeper and more resonant, and to sound as if it was really booming out inside a real space, as if it was rattling the space with its power. And we delivered these various kind of parts of the sandwich, as we think of it, to Joe Walker, who was the film's editor, who would then sit with Denis Villeneuve and try these things out. And they generally like that as a vibe for the voice. The one thing that we couldn't get, and that they were kind of humming and ahhing about for a long time, was, yes, but how do we communicate that Paul, who we first see using the voice right at the beginning of the film in that sort of breakfast with his mother scene, it hasn't quite grasped the voice yet, because later on he's going to be put to the test where he has to save himself and his mother in the ornithopter by using it. We need to see that he hasn't quite got it, and that at that moment later in the film he finally gets it. And I believe it was Joe and Denis messing around with the different parts of the sandwich we'd given them. And as Joe often does, he's always experimenting with the timeline, both visually and sonically. And he came up with a great sort of visual and sonic language of how the voice works. You know, you cut to the person who is having the voice used on them as the voice is happening. And when you cut to that person, you hear those ancient voices. And when we tried for the first time shifting that kind of bassy impact layer, the weapon version of the voice, slipping the sync of that so that when we first see Paul use it, we just hear his mouth move as if he's speaking the words, but we just hear like that bass come out of his mouth. And it seems completely weird at first. We then cut to Jessica and we hear the ancient voices kind of meddling with her head. We see her start to pass the glass to him, and then we realize that was in her head too. This is like a mastery of sort of manipulation of time on the part of Joe Walker, showing us that when the voice is used, it messes with your head. It shows you see yourself doing the action you've been commanded to do before you've even done it. So he's kind of constructed this whole explanation of how the voice works in that very first moment. And it was really their idea that a non-proficient user of the voice, you see all of these parts separate. You hear the bass before you hear the ancient voices. Then in the next scene where the voice is used, it's the Reverend Mother Mahayam who has to be the most proficient user of the voice. And when she uses it, it's so weaponized, it's so precise that all of those things come into sharp focus. All of those elements of the sandwich punch you in the face at once. What are the first words that she utters? It's just "come here," I think.
Yeah, because he questions why she's there, and then she says "come here," and
then
draws
you get hit with "come here."
Yeah,
kneel. Yeah. And you see him. Again, there's Joe Walker's sort of visual timeline trickery. We see a shot of him walking towards her inside his head before he's even started to walk. So a certain aspect of the sort of magic of the voice are those layers that we've come up with. But I think that kind of final touch is the way that Joe's edited it, created, like, when you use the voice, you're not just manipulating a person, you're somehow screwing with time and space itself.
That's physics. Changing the physics of the world.
I know we kind of might be slightly pressed for time, but I've got 3 questions that I really want to sort of push on with, that I kind of want to get answers on. The first one is the use of silence in the film. There's the scene where the Harkins and
Sardaukar,
they have the meeting and then they just get silent, and then there's just the subtitles. And for a film that's quite loud and grandiose with like the spaceships and the idea of mining and everything, how difficult is it to create moments of silence in a film like this?
Well, it's certainly not difficult with a director like Denis, because he has a very practical and intuitive sense of how to use sound dramatically, and he's smart enough to know that you can't be at the Spinal Tap 11 for 2.5 hours. This also really is an acknowledgement of Ron Bartlett and Doug Hemphill, our 2 re-recording mixers, because they, more than anyone else, have their hands on the tools that will determine how loud things are and how quiet things are, and many other creative interventions in between. This is where the art and the science of recording and mixing really shines, because Ron and Doug have such a dramatic impact on how loud and quiet all of those scenes might be. I wish we had them here to really speak very specifically about that contribution. I mean, arguably, Theo and I are tasked with, as sound designers, it's not that we are not concerned with the dynamics of a soundtrack, meaning how loud and soft anything is or isn't. But more importantly, we're tasked with creating the content from which mixers will then conduct to create a pleasing blend of all the sounds that we've created.
We quite often put a sound in, also knowing that we don't really need it. We'll put something there just in case during the mix. I think those Sardaukar, I thought you were going to mention that earlier. That's why I called out Sardaukar. There's the guys who sort of drop silently from the sky. We don't see any parachute. We don't see any cord or anything. So again, we're assuming, God, these guys have some kind of technology that means they're able to just sort of para out of the sky without making a noise. And then it's like, of course, they're like the stealth killers. They wouldn't be making some noise as they drop down. But, it may be that during the mix, we would actually decide that's too quiet. It's silly for it to be silent. We need kind of some sort of slight whoosh or something as they come down. So, yeah, sometimes we provide things that really we also sort of secretly know we don't need. But as Mark says, Ron and Doug often become the kind of storytellers using the selection of what we're to hear at any given moment in order to forward the story in the best way possible. And there are moments where they help us sculpt those moments of sort of dropping out into almost silence. There's the moment where Paul gets hit by the wind that contains a spice overdose for him. It kind of takes him by surprise. The first, the bit I mean, when they're sort of rescuing the sandcrawler from the worm, the first time that we really get to experience the desert from Paul's perspective. And it's as if reality just gets kind of swept out by this spice wind, and suddenly we're inside his head. Like I was saying before, we kind of go into one of the very few sort of synthetic textures that's meant to indicate what it's like to be having a spice hallucination. But it's weird because we go from a huge roar of all of these engines and noise and we're out. I mean, that's something which we partly sculpted ourselves, and yet Doug Hemphill came in there with a big filter sweep and just helped that be a really transformative moment. And most of the time people get what the intention is, but I love the fact that Doug, who had been in an audience of an early screening of the movie, heard someone who was sat behind him at that moment go, "What happened? Did he go deaf?" we playing with silence is a dangerous game in a movie, because it is possible that you bring people out of the movie. Most of the time you don't, but like people can turn around and go, what happened to the projector? Did the sound go? It's weird when you go silent in a movie, and you have to be really careful with it.
Don't underestimate how dangerous that is. I have experienced that at least twice, that when you go to true silence, when you have a zealous filmmaker who says, no, take all the sound out. I want it to be absolute digital zeros. The first reaction is always, what happened to the projector? And you lose your audience. So even when you want true silence, you cannot and should not have true silence. You must leave some scintilla of audio to tell the audience the projector is still running.
I think we've all had that moment where you have that, when you look back and you think, oh, wow, that's crazy, isn't it? What's happened to the sound? And if you're taking out that movie, then the movie's sort of failed in what they're trying to do. And that's
you never want to take people out of the film, however much of an impact you can have doing something like that. They're the one thing you can never really do to an audience, unless you really want them to be pulled out of the reality you've been so carefully trying to immerse them in, is something like that, where they think that there's something wrong with the actual technical projection of the movie. That's real death.
Yep.
My next question is, when you have your sound design and everything that you've created, and then you've got the score, what is the process in terms of that they mixed well together and not have that one doesn't sort of elope the other in when the film's being projected and in the cinema?
With a filmmaker like Denis Villeneuve, we have that is a traditional conflict in cinema. Filmmakers think or go into a project believing in traditional post-production, which says after the shoot, sound editors start and composers start, and they work in these separate lanes, and they arrive at the mix with all these components, and we have to sort it all out. Denis, for a variety of reasons, is smarter than that and engages score and sound much earlier in the process, as early as the beginning of the shoot, and is conducting that interplay from a very early stage, such that when arrival at the mix, most of that, what might be conflict of should score predominate here, should sound design predominate here, has already been sorted out, because Theo and I, as we did on Blade Runner and on Dune, began early discussions with Hans Zimmer and began sharing sounds and music so that we could work out some of those potential clashes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that on almost every movie I've ever worked on, other than a Denis Villeneuve movie, there's been the intention for sound and music to be carefully coordinating, and yet the reality is that we don't, because we're used to working separately. No one likes to hand over unfinished work to someone, you know what I mean? Especially if it hasn't been approved by the director, especially if it hasn't made it to the final mix. It's really hard to, I've worked as a composer as well, and it's horrible having to hand over something that's a draft and have everyone judge it, before it's even actually found its place in the movie. So it really takes a very special effort, I think, on both the sound and music teams' parts to be prepared to coordinate and let each other hear each other's, work in progress. But I'm so glad that we did, especially on Dune. I think there are multiple areas where, because we were planning things, because we were talking, because we were sharing, we were able to create a kind of handoff from one department to another. So, what I was talking about earlier is saying that sound can sometimes get in there subliminally and set the scene in a way that you don't even know that the filmmaker is intending you to feel a certain way. In the way that when music comes in, especially if music comes in suddenly, you're like, oh, right, so this is a scary scene. One of the wonderful things that you're able to do if you coordinate sound design and score that carefully is the sound design can start subliminally suggesting something, and then either very slowly hand over to the score, or kind of dovetail, as we might say, or just smoothly pass the emotion from one to the other, or you're able to have, a very jarring takeover, or you're able to do that in a meaningful place. I'm trying to think of a good example. I guess in the Gom Jabbar scene, the one where Paul is being tested with the pain box and the deadly needle at his neck, we start that scene off with hints of the pain that he's going through. Can we hear a kind of crackling of burning flesh? Do we hear a kind of sound that could be like a dentist drill? Like all of the things that in our subconscious say pain, I'm trying to withstand this pain, we're hinting at it. Hans starts creeping in with his score, also kind of with certain painful tones, but they're kind of interlocking with ours. You're not really sure who it is that's making those sounds. And then there's a moment in the scene where Paul suddenly gains control over the pain, where he's suddenly pushing back what the Mother Mahayam is inflicting on him. And they exchange a glance, and you see that Mother Mahayam is looking at him as like, who is this? Is this the Kwisatz Haderach? Has he got some special status, some special power? And that's the moment where Hans's score suddenly comes in with a new note and takes over the scene. And at that point, our sound design almost pulls back and lets Hans continue the story. Things like that, slow transitions between sound design and music, and sort of special handovers like that just can't be done in the mix. You would never have the time. But it would just be random whether it worked or not if you try to sort of bring those two things together in those final couple of weeks where you're mixing. So yeah, I think one of the reasons that the movie has that very integrated feel between the sound and the music is because Denis Villeneuve told us, we got to talk, we got to share ideas, we got to make these things dovetail together.
Yeah, because I always think about how sometimes you don't want one or the other to sort of elope each other with the sound, and when you're going on that, like being brought on so early on must help, and also sharing ideas, because I can imagine it being not necessarily daunting, but sharing stuff that's not fully finished to one another, and then being like, oh, that doesn't sound great, or that could be worked on quite a lot. But at least that way you're in constant communication with ideas of, well, this is what we have, this is what he has, let's see.
Well, but you know what? It's a reflection or an acknowledgement of the sort of unpredictable nature of creativity. Denis, more than anyone, understands and respects that what we do is a process as sound designers and composers. I don't have any fear of feeding Hans or Joe or Denis or Theo an early work, because Theo or Hans or Joe or Denis will give feedback that improves the next iteration of it. But as we do that collectively, everything gets better. You know, the tide rises. What's the expression I'm looking for? The boat rises with the tide. We don't fear that process. We embrace that process.
And I love the fact that comes from, it's top down. I think if you're working with a director who, like, honestly, frankly, many people do, and it's not just directors of films, it's this, managers of companies and people in a boardroom meeting can have the same effect. Someone comes up with an idea that they're not sure it's going to work. And if the manager or the director says, what are you thinking? That's a stupid idea. Why would you, if they make you feel stupid for coming up with something that's a bit left field, then you're not going to get any interesting ideas coming up in that meeting or in that film or whatever it is. Whereas when you have a leader who knows how to embrace an idea and knows how to take an idea that might be left of center and think, actually, there is a way we can use that, even if you weren't quite right, spot on how that was going to be used in the film. And Denis is absolutely that person. He's never made me feel stupid for coming up with something, which sometimes these ideas are stupid. We come up with something, how about we put, a cat purring in here for this? And some people would just, react the wrong way and make you feel stupid and make you I think that's the reason why some things end up being generic, cliche. People rely on the stuff that everyone knows it's going to be okay because we've heard it 100 times before. So no one's going to say that's stupid. Obviously, it's fine. We've heard it in 100 other movies. I think when you've got someone like Denis who's encouraging the experimental, everybody tries their hardest to come out with original ideas.
There's been a funny gag going around our crew that none of us knew about until we all started doing these roundtables together. We're all aware and are encouraged to take risks, and yet there's still the imposter syndrome in all of us, where none of us feel like maybe any of our ideas are any good. And we've discovered that all of us, when required to present new ideas to Denis, usually preface the ideas with a phrase that goes something like, "You're probably going to hate this, but," and that's a good way of framing this kind of anxiety we all feel about presenting crazy ideas, but understanding that Denis will always receive them correctly and encouragingly.
That's something that just sounds like the perfect collaborator to work with, that they're open to receive ideas and go from there and sort of build on what you guys are creating, and maybe even sort of change their mind of how things should sound or how things are being created as well. But just to move on to my final question, when you are designing the sound for a film that's going to be shown in IMAX, or I guess in the case of Dune, once the release sort of changed a little bit to the point that it could be viewed at home, or as some people like to do it as well, on their phone on the way to work or something. Do you take these things into consideration about the different formats that this film is going to be viewed in? Or do you just go all out and just say, well, if it's going to be an IMAX, we're going to create something that's going to be for IMAX. And if it gets downscaled to like a phone, for example, do you just decide so be it? Or do you tweak it a little bit for each format?
We do tweak all of those formats except for over a phone are considered. It is part of our recording process. Atmos, IMAX, Oro, home theater, streaming, all are afforded an amount of time to make a specific mix for that format. So they are taken into consideration. I've heard rumors of films mixing to an iPad and monitoring over those tiny little speakers, but I sure hope that never creeps into my process.
We did have to make sure, I think, that certain things that are kind of vital to the story and yet very sonically odd, like the voice, like that bass element of the voice. We did want to make sure that even if someone did watch that on something like a laptop or an iPad, it wasn't going to be completely gone. We certainly don't mix for that eventuality. But when we did the stereo mix, which is what someone would listen to on a lower grade device like that, we did make adjustments to make sure that that bass, something which would never come out of a phone or an iPad or a laptop speaker, would in some way be represented. You would in some way be able to hear it. But yeah, as Mark says, I mean, Dolby Atmos is the originating format, the one that we mix for. We then make adjustments for those different formats like IMAX, very minor adjustments in the sense. But I would say for this movie, more than any other that I've worked on, we realized that people are going to be watching this on all kinds of devices. It's not just going to be a purely theatrical release. So I guess we did sort of subconsciously avoid using things that would be inaudible to people watching in stereo. And that those few things like the voice, where we went very, very deep with the bass, we did make sure that that wouldn't be completely lost on someone watching on let's say at least a TV screen. But yes, you certainly can't mix for the lowest common denominator and then hope it's going to be okay for the better things like cinema releases. It's the cinema release is the keystone, and everything else we just make sure that it's going to be all right.
I remember early on, Theo, help me if I don't get the text of this as accurate as I remember it, but after Blade Runner, Denis commented to us, Blade Runner was a film that had a significant amount of low frequency information in the subwoofer. And Denis was concerned that on Dune, he wanted a soundtrack that if his grandmother were flying, coast to coast and listened on the airplane, she'd be able to fully appreciate all the sound that we prepared. And that might not include this heavy reliance on subwoofers. So he said, let's keep that in mind. Let's keep my grandmother in mind as we finish the audio for this film, so that it is as enjoyable for her on the plane as it is for you in the cinema.
He did. That's exactly right.
Did he ever mention if your grandmother liked it or not?
Well, we haven't heard that yet, have we, Theo?
Not yet. No. Gosh, I hope she does. We're in trouble if she didn't.
But I think it's just so you could always tell the difference when you're in various cinemas and the way that they've calibrated the sound, or if they have Dolby Atmos or and whatnot. And sometimes that sound does bleed into up from other screens if you're on another screen without those things. So sometimes you'd be like, well, what's going on in there? But it's always, I guess, with viewers ever changing, the way that people view things is ever changing. Especially, I am guilty of watching things on my phone sometimes with headphones and not with the sound on. But it's interesting to see what you can pick up with on sound as well through headphones. I don't know that it's just not the same, but it is something that is interesting to see how it changes. And I hope that you guys don't have to put in your process to work with stuff like iPads or anything in the future, because it is so important, that aspect, to keep it as for stuff like Atmos and systems like that, so people can actually appreciate it rather than have it tainted by having it put on stuff like iPad speakers and everything.
I certainly hope so. I mean, it's if we ever go into the mixing theatre and they've made the screen vertical rather than horizontal, that's the moment I'm going to start to worry.
Oh, please don't give people ideas. Please, no.
I didn't say that.
That's going to be the next thing. So move over 3D TVs and everything. It's going to be the vertical TVs.
Just phone format for
portrait mode in the cinema. Oh, Theo, it's so cringeworthy.
No.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to edit that out so that people, so that I can
Please,
take that.
please do.
Don't put it out in the ether at all.
I'll do it so that I can then take the idea and make it a multi-billion-dollar idea, and I'll make sure that there's a residual. And then there'll be residual checks in the post, so don't worry.
What have I done? What have I done?
Mark, Theo, thank you very much for your time. Thank you again for taking time to speak with me. Dune is now out on streaming. Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, it was a pleasure.
You guys take care and have a good one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay.
I'm off to eat my pork and cheese sushi.
Oh, I think my stomach just turned.
Leave you with that thought.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.